Right, the war had ended. Marcus was back from fighting in the Middle East, and his company commander had offered him a job as an administrative manager for a tobacco farm in Rhodesia. Marcus had been employed by the Standard Bank in Maritzburg. On his return home, he went to the Standard Bank, walked inside, and almost immediately walked out. He said, "I couldn't bear that sort of existence." So he was bound for Rhodesia. He was going to live in a house on a tobacco farm, and Anthony Brown, who was his company commander in the war, had told him that he should take his mother with him, knowing Marcus wasn't married. So Mum was due to go to Rhodesia with Marcus, and then at the last moment I was thrown in. So both Mum and I, and my friend Michael Barrett, who was coming with us, moved into the house on Riversdale Farm near Mazoe in Rhodesia. It was a tremendous challenge for me because I was actually quite handy with electricals, wiring, woodwork and things like that. And the house desperately needed to be upgraded. So I spent most of my time being helped by Michael, doing the electrification of the house and making it respectable. I loved this new life. Marcus gave me a horse. And I used to ride every day. His immediate boss was an elderly man, Major Alec Brown, who was a remittance man from some 20 years back. And he got a big fat allowance every quarter from England. Came from a very rich family. Anyhow, Marcus set about getting to know all the neighbours, and whenever he went out, he would take me, sometimes my mum. And I really fell for Rhodesia. It was quite a wrench, though, when I was due to go back to Maritzburg, to Natal University. There was no argument. I had to go. So I came back to Natal University College, and for the first year I lived with my sister Pat and her husband John Lovell Green. He was an ex-carbineer, and he and I were very close friends. It was he who got me to join a cricket club that operated from the Oval in Maritzburg called Izingari. We played in the same team, and I met lots of his friends. I think the last one has just died. John was murdered by a man he lent money to. Pat and John lived in Scottsville, within walking distance of the Oval. So on quite a few occasions, John and I would stagger home after the pub, which was open at the Oval, after cricket matches. I was quite a useful member of the batting side. played cricket on Saturday afternoon and Sunday, all round Maritzburg in the country districts. So suddenly I had quite a social life, and one which I enjoyed very much indeed. I'm afraid my time at university was wasted. But I don't think I would change it in any way if I had my time again. However, Marcus insisted on taking me back for every university holiday. So in July I was back in Rhodesia, back doing wiring for him and catching up with his social life. I became a very devout Rhodesian. Rhodesia was great fun in those days. The Governor General was Major General Kennedy. And very quickly Marcus had got to know him because he'd been a gunner, like Marcus, and he had 2 lovely daughters. But there were so many men after the 2 daughters, Marcus never had a hope. He wasn't aggressive enough. But every quarter, the Governor General would throw a ball. And if you got an invitation to the ball, it was on behalf of the Queen, and no ways did you ever refuse. You couldn't refuse, you had to attend. But they were well worth it. It was always a full dinner jacket affair, masses of food and drink, and we would dance old-fashioned English dances throughout the night into the early hours of the morning. And we met all sorts of people. I can't remember his name now, perhaps it'll come to me later. But he wrote a book on his escapes from the British police in Palestine. He'd been with his brother had been with the police, and his brother in England received one of these letters with a bomb in it. But he got it. Fortunately, he suspected what it was and took it to the local constabulary, and they exploded it. It would have killed him. But he was a fascinating man to meet. The ADC to the Governor General became a close friend of ours. So we had all the contacts for quite a social life. I joined the Salisbury Sports Club, where I would play cricket and rugby and squash. I used to play squash a lot with Marcus. He loved the game. So did I. But it was a beautiful clubhouse. I played for the second 15 sports, rugby, and the first 11 cricket. Then I met a lovely girl. Her name was Athley Harley. She came from the Free State, where her father was the captain of the Free State polo side. So she was also a keen rider, and often before work we'd go out to Mount Hampden, where we rented horses, and we'd ride till about 8 o'clock. In those days, everyone rode a bicycle to work. There were very few cars. It was immediate post-war, so cars were in very short supply, almost unknown. And at that time, Rhodesia was being flooded by immigrants from England. Mostly men who had decided that they couldn't return to the old social splits of pre-war England. Many of them carried that snobbishness to Rhodesia, but most didn't. They were an exciting bunch of men. And if you look at Rhodesia as it was in those days and compare it with the mess today, it's a real tragedy. Because real brains went into the growing of Rhodesia. Their agricultural development was streets ahead of what it is in this country. We're nowhere near what it was in Rhodesia then. On a couple of occasions, I was selected to play for a cricket team, and we went to Nyasaland and spent 3 or 4 days in Nyasaland playing cricket, but mostly drinking. The amount of alcohol I consumed, I regret very much today. I don't know what it did for me. I got nothing out of it. But it added to the environment. And I'd wormed my way into Rhodesia by signing a 6-month contract to go and work for the Auditor General as an audit clerk. So Rhodesian government paid my rail fare up and my little bits of furniture. At the end of 6 months, I left the Auditor General. I couldn't bear it. It was so boring. And I went to work for the tobacco auctions as a clerk. Well, I wasn't there a week when Gallagher's met me and asked me if I wouldn't go and work for them in Nyasaland. And they made such a good offer that I accepted. So I was then suddenly out of Rhodesia into Nyasaland. And that really was one of the nicest times of my life. I became a member of the Limby Country Club. I shared a house with an English schoolmaster, Derek Johnson Hill. We had a cook. I had a batman. Derek had a batman. The cook had an assistant. And we had a gardener, and the gardener had an assistant. And we used to pay them 2 shillings and 6pence. That's 25 cents a week, for which they were very grateful. So I lived rather like a colonial. Whiskey was 10 pence. That's about 10 cents a tot, and beer was the equivalent of 50 cents because it had to be imported from England. So I learned to drink whiskey there. And I learned to play golf. For a long time, some years, I held the record for the longest drive on the course. Every year we had a driving competition. And it was held in winter when the ground is dry and hard. So one's ball bounced jolly well. My drive that won the competition was 310 meters, yards, sorry. It was before metrication. But after a while I realized there was no future for me being a tobacco clerk in Gallagher. And I came back to Rhodesia. Marcus had got me a job with a tobacco grading firm in Marandellas, and I lived in the hotel there. And I had a bike that I used to ride to work every day, where I learned to grade tobacco. And then after 6 months, I got a job as a learner farmer with John Liston Dalrymple. And there I learned how to grow tobacco. I was on that for a year when I was offered a job by Lord Acton to run his little show up at Sonoya. It was a small section on a vast estate, but Lord Acton owned it himself. So up to Sonoya I traipsed on my motorbike, and my luggage all came in the train. And the day that I rode over to my farm from Sonoya station, I passed a leopard on the road. I didn't know whether to see that as a good omen or not. Anyhow, I was all on my own as a section manager. I loved it. And while I was there, I met a lovely girl, Jane Westinghouse. And eventually I chucked it all up and went back to England with her. I went to England because she was going back. She'd been married to Laurie Westinghouse, a son of the great Westinghouse railway brake inventor. But they didn't hit it off, and Jane and I did. So I arrived in England, dressed like a tobacco farmer. And Jane's father was a brigadier general in the Royal Engineers. He had been, but he still kept the rank. And he couldn't bear the sight of what he thought was his future son-in-law dressed like a tobacco farmer. So I was then re-equipped with a suit so I could look respectable. But arriving in England was great fun. I arrived in the mist, past the Isle of Wight on my left, and all I could see was every now and then vivid blurs of green. And when the ship docked at Southampton, I was on the Bloemfontein Castle. The Queen Mary was almost next to us. It happened to be that we were going to be faced with the driest summer for years and years. I didn't know that, and I didn't appreciate it. However, I was living in a cottage in Sir Richard Young's estate. He was the vice chairman of Tube Investments. And the Brigadier General's boss was Richard Young. But I had to earn money, and the easiest way I could do it was by getting a job with the government grass dryer. There was a unit in the area, which was an agricultural area, and this unit would visit a farmer in the morning, cut all his grass, move it to the grass dryer, and at the end of the day returned to him cubes of dried grass. So my job was to stand on the back of a truck following the tractor that was cutting the grass. We would load the grass onto the truck, then go to the grass drying unit and offload the grass. I thought it was an easy job. But the next morning when I woke up, I could hardly move. I was so stiff. It was agony. And that agony lasted about 4 days. However, I finally got used to it. I enjoyed the company of the other farm workers. There were 2 who'd never left Warwickshire in their lives, and they were in their 70s. And when they weeded, they went so fast I hadn't a hope of catching up with them. One day we arrived at a farmer who made his own cider. He had an apple orchard. And he brought several bottles out to us at tea time. Tea time was 10 o'clock. I just loved this stuff. I drank a whole bottle. And about 15 minutes later, I had to get off the truck and go and sleep it off under a tree. I did that for a while until I'd accumulated some money in my pocket. I then started to look for a job, assisted by the Brigadier General. He was very ambitious for me. He took me to an aptitude institute in London where they tested you and told you what your aptitude was. My aptitude was to run a small business, to keep away from large corporations. They said I was too independent-minded. The best advice I've ever had in my life. Anyhow, I soon got a job with Tube Investments, who also employed the Brigadier General. He was their human resources manager. And I got a job with what was called TI Plastics. Tube Investments made steel tubes. Everything from a hypodermic needle to a 75-pound cannon. But they were investigating the potential competition that they could expect from plastic tubes. So I spent time in their research and development laboratories, seeing how they made polyester resin, glass fiber tubes and ordinary polythene tubes. And after a while I was put out on the road to go and sell the plastic tubes to hardware shops and municipalities. The polyester tubes I tried to sell to industry. My first big order was from Shell. However, after a while, Jane and I broke up. So I moved out, and I was then transferred to Leicester, which was a delightful Midlands town. I joined the local cricket club, played cricket all the time that I could. I also tried my hand at hunting. That was far too expensive for me. I also met some super chaps in the cricket club. One of my highlights of the cricket club was attending a dinner in London of the 40 Club. Occasionally, the local 40 Club, which consisted of men all above the age of 40 who played public schools and whatnot on Wednesdays, used to employ me for my youth because I could bowl fairly fast. And once a year, they had a very posh dinner in London. And I went up with Dr. Stainton to the dinner place. And what a selection of guest speakers. There was Peter May, who captained England. I can't remember his name, but he was the British Judge President. There was also the Master of the Rolls. There were two ancient cricketers whose name will mean nothing to you now. But they were famous in England for the cricket they'd played. I remember sitting next to the man who formed the Guinness Book of Records. But I can't remember his name. McWhirter. There must have been 500 people to dinner that night. And all we talked about was cricket. So back to Leicester, where I got the bad news that TR Plastics was closing down. TR had decided that the plastics tube was no competitor to a steel tube. But they gave me a very generous payout, as a result of which I bought a ticket to France. Before I bought it, though, I saw in the newspaper an advertisement put in by IBM for someone to go out to Rhodesia for them. So I took off for Paris, where I was for 5 weeks. And when I came back, I went to see IBM and they hired me, but not to go to Rhodesia. They'd given the job already to someone else. But I was to work for them as a learner salesman, which meant doing a course in their punch card equipment and systems for 2 years. And then when I'm on my own, I'd be earning a very good salary, all of which came true. But that was IBM's very first adventure into England. And for me, it was a fantastic experience. I certainly learned how to work hard. Once I'd finished my 2-year course, I was given a new customer called Chivers Jam, who operated from Cambridge. So I went down to Cambridge and I got a room like every other Cambridge student. But the landlady had been in Rhodesia. So I felt quite at home with her. Anyhow, I could only work at night on the punch card machines. And many times I would work from 8 in the morning till 8 the next day. Go home for 4 hours sleep and then back on the job. But I got it going in the end. And my boss, whose name was Mayers, wrote me a very nice letter of congratulation. Because he said for once he hadn't had to pull in the fire brigade to put it all right. Then I was transferred to West London. At that stage, I was working from the City of London. Just down the road from us was the Bank of England. And I'd go to work every day with my bowler hat, my black umbrella, and my briefcase. Always in a white shirt and always in a suit. What a change from the dress of a tobacco farmer. So when I was transferred to West London, I was given a quota of rent to sell, which I made my first year. And all quota salesmen were given a fantastic party somewhere in Europe every year. And the year that I made my quota, we went to Madrid. And it was whilst I was in Madrid that I met Ed Sompi, who was the Africa manager, and Smuts, Cowley, and a couple of others from South Africa, who'd also made their quota and were attending the same celebration. When I met Sompi, he said, "Aren't you a South African?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Wouldn't you like to come back to South Africa?" I said, "Yes, very much so." Well, by that time, I was married. So Ed Sompi said he would move me with all my furniture and my wife to South Africa. I haven't told you about my wife. My wife was Julie Anna Lester. Now, when I boarded the Bloemfontein Castle in Durban to come to England, I stood in a queue to get a meal ticket, which every passenger had to do, because there were so many passengers that meals were served in 4 sections. And I stood next to a man, a doctor, someone, charming old fellow, who invited me to sit next to him at his table. So I did. Then I found myself sitting opposite my future wife and her mother. I fell for my wife, but I was always dead scared of my future mother-in-law. She really was a ferocious old battle axe. So we had quite an affair on the boat. It was great fun. Affairs then were not like affairs today. They were very correct and proper. But I said goodbye to her at Southampton as I was going to meet Jane. Anyhow, it was 2 years later when I was then quite a successful quota salesman in London. It was the middle of summer, and I was on a bus going home. I lived in Knightsbridge, and the bus was creeping down to the Knightsbridge main road because there was no traffic at all, and its schedule was calculated, was based on there being a lot of traffic. So we just crept down the road, and when we were opposite famous departmental store, when we were opposite Harrods, I saw Juliana walking up the road with a friend of hers. So I jumped off the bus, wasn't going that fast, ran over to her. We were very pleased to see each other, and that started my married life. I took her to a nightclub that night. But I didn't ask her to marry me. We had quite an affair in London, and she told me that she had to go back to South Africa. It's all part of her mother's plan for her. At the end of August. So I said goodbye to her at the airport, and she was gone. But I decided there and then that I was going to marry this girl. And after she'd been in South Africa a couple of weeks, I wrote and asked her. And I said, I've also written to your mother and father, which I had. They all said, okay. So we arranged to get married in Maritzburg at the beginning of February, 15th of February. I remember flying out of London at the end of January, leaving behind driving blizzard. It was unbelievably cold, and I couldn't imagine what it was going to be like when I arrived in South Africa. However, I did. Got to South Africa, and to cut a long story short, we got married at St. Peter's Church in Maritzburg. It was a very happy marriage. And after about 15 months, I think Roger arrived. But by then we were back in England, living in Taplow. Roger was born at home, because in those days in England, a woman couldn't have a baby in hospital unless her GP certified that there was a complication, that there were potential of complications. So she was born at home, and I was there when he arrived. Shortly after her, my mother-in-law arrived and took over. But that was her way. Anyhow, we'll come back to my life with Kate later. I accepted Ed Sompe's offer very gratefully, and Kate also was very pleased, because she didn't much care for married life in England in those days. It was terribly cold in the winter. We didn't have central heating. And our lives were consumed with domesticity. Keeping the house clean, making beds, doing the washing up, polishing shoes, you name it. We had to do it because there were absolutely no servants at all. So the prospect of going out to South Africa, where we would have a servant, at least one, was very attractive. In fact, I couldn't wait to get back. I have no regrets for coming back. I'm glad I did, because I don't think I wanted to live all my life in England. I love this country. I love its opportunities. You don't get opportunities in England like you get out here. Anyhow, we sold our house to a chap who was to be a new doctor. He paid us half. The other half was going to be sent out later, but we never got it. But I'll never forget arriving in South Africa. My friend Mike Chapman, who was my best man at our wedding, was there to meet us. And he had a driver driving his little MG, which he lent to me for the time that I was in Durban. It was only a week, but we had this lovely little MG to drive around in. Then we came up to Johannesburg, and we stayed first of all in Parktown, or was it Parktown North? It was in November. There was no rain. What a change from the English weather. I liked all the chaps in IBM. Although I thought really they drank far too much. But we had the same quota system out here as we had in England, and fortunately I made it. And our first party for celebration was in Paris. And that's a film on its own, an IBM quota party in Paris. We were supposed to work from 8 till 12 and then go out on the tiles. Well, we did. I shared a room with a Dane. I don't think he slept for the whole week we were there. He could drink whiskey like it was water. And I didn't see him from 8 to 12 once. I don't know where he was, but he had a head like concrete. Anyhow, back to South Africa. Where I'd become very unhappy, because when I was a salesman in England, I was given the whole of the Northwest Territory of London, and I ran it like my own business. Back in South Africa, it was a totally different picture. There I was controlled all day and every day. And I found that very difficult to accept. Then I met the boss of Fraser and Chalmers, who offered me a job in Durban. He said if I set up a punch card installation to do their wages and production control at the new Shell refinery, he would pay all the expenses if I would run it. And it was a 2-year contract. So I left IBM, no regrets, and went down to Durban, took Kate with me, Juliana, And we set up house in Westville. And I was in business on my own, which I thoroughly enjoyed. We were first of all stationed at Isipingo, and then when my contract finished, we moved to Hermitage Street, which is in the centre of Durban. And things went very well for me, especially when I signed a big contract with an American company. I didn't sign a contract. We never had a contract. It was a gentleman's agreement. And the managing director of the company said, if I wanted a contract, it would take 9 months to clear from America. But he said, you can trust me, which I did. So I stopped getting new business and I concentrated entirely on doing his entire sales analysis, stock controls, debtors and statements, the pay envelopes, everything. And we were going along very nicely when suddenly he had a massive heart attack. And that was the end of me, because America sent out immediately a man to replace him who didn't like the look of this computer-operated operation. He thought that IBM should give him his own installation. And IBM, of course, jumped at the chance. So that was the end of my income in Durban. I was not insolvent. I just gave back the machinery to IBM. And then Julianne and I moved up to Johannesburg. No regrets. Durban was a computer backwater. It took me years to catch up with everyone up here. I've left out some very important factors. The first was the arrival of Titus. But Titus had arrived in Johannesburg when I was still working for IBM. We were living in Bryanston, and I remember so clearly one Sunday night, Kate says to me, I think I'm going to have a baby now. I think my baby is arriving. So I whipped her into the hospital where she spent the night and then came back the next day. It was a false alarm. But the following week was the real thing. And then the doctor, Dr. Clark, and I went to the hospital, the nursing home together, which was run by nuns. The nun met us at the front and said, which is the doctor? Who's the father? Well, whilst I'd been present at Roger's birth, the nuns wouldn't allow me to be present at Titus's birth, which was a great pity. However, he was a fine young man. And when we were in Durban, living in Hillcrest, Mungo arrived and was born at Marion Hill. There, of course, they were much more sensible and allowed me to be present. And 15 months later, to our absolute surprise, Dominic was on the way, and he was born in 65, after I decided to close the business. But he came up to, so I had all 4 boys in Johannesburg for my second go. I originally worked for Redmond in their computer business, and then Control Data approached me and asked me to run their show here, which I did. And through them, I visited the States on a number of occasions. But I struggled with that company because being in Durban for 5 years, I'd got out of the swing of things. And the third generation computer had already arrived. And when I left Johannesburg, the first generation computer was all the rage. So I was at a disadvantage for many years until I caught up. And that was no mean task.